Sundays tend to stress people out, especially if you're the workaholic type accustomed to a week of frenzied activity. Sundays bring with them ostensibly relaxation, but with that vacuum comes a stress born of having nothing to do, so we tend to turn inward. And one reason people tend to be workaholics is to avoid that exact internal state. When you're so busy scrambling job to job, project to project, family responsibilities, colleagues, going from here to there, doing this and that, you don't have time to think about the horrors of being human, as the existentialists like to coin it. So I'm sitting here on a Sunday, and I tend to be the workaholic type, especially with creating content. And it's actually the opposite kind of feeling, because in this silence, in this relative stasis, I've got an opportunity to do what I love to do, which is to introspect, share more content, and in this case, read a short story that I wrote decades ago that reverberates through my heart and soul for just so many reasons. Hello and welcome to the No Hair, All Heart podcast. I'm your No Hair, All Heart host and reader, Mookie Spitz. And this Sunday, I am going to read Stilts, a short story about my father's childhood friend. Here's a little quick backstory to the short story. And after I read it, I'm also going to share an addendum which I think is equally important for understanding the story, its context, and what it's meant over all these years. And I'm pretty sure you, with your own family history, regardless of ethnicity, country even, will be able to relate. About 30 years ago, I was living in my hometown of Chicago, having been estranged from my father Laszlo since my mother's suicide several years before. On a whim, my childhood friend Kathy reintroduced me to her father, George, who was my father's childhood friend from Budapest since well before World War II, which they both barely survived. Getting to know George must have triggered a compensatory inclination to hang out with him a couple times a month. Without thinking much about the obvious, I was swapping one bad dad for another. The two linked through Kathy and a half-century of friendship between interwoven families, 2 emigrations, and the Holocaust. George was a successful CPA and real estate guy who lived in a swank condo downtown, and I was a struggling artist who lived uptown with a dancer named Lynette. George was like an anti-father, an anti-Laszlo. The two were complementary, diametric opposites in body and personality type, ability and demeanor, in nearly every way imaginable. I could not conceive of two more different, and in these ways opposite, human beings. What they shared in common was severe childhood trauma, thanks to the war, and PTSD that manifested into an eccentric, distinctly Eastern European Jewish style of morose, self-destructive narcissism. In essence, they were assholes and terrible fathers, learning nothing from fascism ravaging all of Europe and the world, both then ravaging their own families. Now that comes across as super harsh, super judgmental. But if you chat or get to know any kind of Holocaust survivor family, you're going to encounter variations of this theme. Understandably, growing up in such a household held its own cross-generational traumas. And in other podcasts, I'll dive deeper into that specific dynamic. But suffice to say, take my word for it. If Kathy would be here next to me by this microphone, she would concur from her own end of the shit stick survivor daughter-son family dynamic. It's a shame, but it's common. And one thing that might either implicitly be felt or just explicitly pop out of this short story is where some of that comes from. Despite all that, George could be entertaining company. And he was exactly that, a born extrovert and a seasoned bullshit artist who told amazing stories. If my own father couldn't finish a sentence, George could go on and on and on, and he did. Since everything was all about George, my visits over to his swank condo on Michigan Avenue in Chicago consisted of him talking about himself, which, thanks to that gift of gab, rarely bored me. And when he was in the mood, he even talked about the war, which my father never did. So I was thrilled. George was entertaining company, and George began to unmask a decisive, formative phase of both his and my own father's childhood, thrown into the cauldron of World War II, both of them, as I mentioned, just barely, improbably surviving the cataclysm that was the Holocaust in Hungary relatively late in the war. An obsessive writer, this short story, Stilts, was my literary interpretation of a particularly interesting chapter of George's survival tale. Wasn't the whole thing. It was a little sliver of an odyssey that culminated in George surviving, emigrating to the United States, Chicago, becoming successful, etc. This was a little sliver, and I was mesmerized by it. I listened closely to him tell it, and then I went home and wrote it down from memory of that conversation, then worked it into the short story posted here. The effort seems like an attempt at the time to learn more about my own father, get closer to him again. Remember, I was estranged from my own dad. I wasn't speaking to him at all. And once or twice a month, I was over at George's, yucking it up. And he would often talk about stories from the war. And that enabled me to have that kind of catharsis with my own dad. I was obviously looking for something Did I find it with George? Well, let's see by the story and how it went over. But the entire process, the listening, the taking notes, the translating it into what I would try to make as literature, was moving to the point that over 30 years later, here I am on this Sunday reading it to you. This biographical tale from George of woe and mischief has come to life as I forged through an archive of my old writing. I wrote. I went through, at least half a dozen computers, little laptops, standalone PCs, disk drives. I printed stuff out. I scanned it. It was kind of a mess, reflective of my mess of a life, very iterant, moving from apartment to apartment. Things got lost, things got found. And I tried to cobble together thousands and thousands of pages of my stuff. And I recently posted of this huge trove an earlier and different kind of short story from that vault. And one that was really rough around the edges. I wrote this in my early 20s, this other short story. And I gave it a little bit of editorial massaging just to clean it up a bit, make it more palatable, make it ready for prime time. I didn't change the essence of it. It was all cosmetic, but I felt I needed to do something before releasing it to the world. The reason I bring that up, twofold, to give context to where this story came from here, the Stilts, but also to demonstrate that aside from fixing a few typos that I found in this story, Stilts, that I'm going to read here, I'm posting this guy verbatim as I wrote it, as I handed it to George, and as he responded to it. In retrospect, this story has withstood that test of time in my own learning curve as a writer. I worked hard to ensure the prose was clear but descriptive, emotional yet non-sentimental. I chose first person, which, as we'll see, might have been part of George's challenge with it, but I'll save that for later. And in my estimation, the success of this piece as a standalone work of biographical fiction was a winner because George said nothing after I gave it to him. I gave it to him with a little bit of fanfare. Hey, George, I've been listening. I told you I want to write your story down. You seem to be excited about me dedicating time to writing your story. I want to be a writer. This is some juicy stuff. Maybe we can even turn this into a full-blown novel. Check this out. And I remember giving him a stack of paper. This was the pretty much the pre-digital era. See what you think. Nothing. No response. I visited him a week or two later. He didn't even bring it up. He didn't mention it. I didn't say anything, assuming he's still reading it. Finally, I don't even remember, a month and a half later, I finally pressed him to respond. Hey, what'd you think of the story? I worked hard to bring this to life. I think it's pretty good. And all he said was, classic George, just to reiterate. You don't need to just take my word for it that he was an asshole. Why would anyone want to read this shit? That was his New York Times book review. Now, at the time, I was crushed. Even my girlfriend Lynette was shocked. She saw how much I dedicated myself to this story. And in response to that, I tucked the story away in a three-ring binder. It was floating around on some discs, some hardware for years. And then I forgot about it for these 3 decades, 30 years gone by. And then I found this stuff, dusted it off. The hard copy print, I OCR scanned it into a PDF. I reread it. And rereading it, I'm just so glad I didn't burn it. I'm glad this stuff didn't get lost forever. At the time, George shat all over it, the same way he shat all over everything and everyone threatening his frail ego. But the quality of the work was directly proportional to the zeal of his wrath. I see that now. When you're a young writer and you're not getting any recognition, and basically society is punishing you for being rogue, for being non-traditional, and you don't even like your writing that much. I've made the observation, especially recently, that now I'm really enjoying content creation. I am freed of the burden of a young writer struggling to make a name or have the validity of a unique point of view, when said young writer is fairly devoid of human experience, when you haven't had a career, when you haven't had a family, when all you've really been doing is thinking hard about stuff, then if you have, frankly, any measure of self-respect, you feel strangled by your own lack of experience, naivete, and presumption for wanting to write something great. What gives me, in my early 20s, the right to go against the grain of friends, family, colleagues, all of society, chasing money, chasing external accomplishment, to dedicate oneself to a craft with no guarantee of any return on investment outside the sheer pleasure of doing it, and do so to the extent that the opportunity costs are enormous for not pursuing what everyone else is pursuing: money, power, influence in the real world. That's a tough nut to crack. It's the character in, as I've mentioned before on some other podcasts, the young playwright in Chekhov's Seagull. That did not end well. Thankfully, I made it. And now, after that career, I'm still careering, but after doing what I deep down felt I had to do to give myself the validity of a voice, career, family, obligations, responsibility, sacrifice, I think my tsunami of content creation now has a lot to do with this feeling that, yeah, I paid my dues. And it's not just going through a checklist, but it's doing what I had to do to, in a sense, grow up to the point where I'm not necessarily proving anything to anyone, but I am validating my voice. I feel like not only do I think I have something to say, but I really have something to say by a world that has repeatedly kicked my ass. And I got back up and I got my ass kicked, and I got back up and I got my ass kicked just like everybody else. And now I have this vantage point of the guy who got his ass kicked, but who's been writing this whole time and in parallel crafting his communication skills. That in and of itself is a wonderful place to be. It's a blessing. It's a gift. These 30 years haven't been idle. And these 30 years, in a sense, haven't even been a distraction or an obstacle to my creativity. Because now I've got the critical mass built up and the momentum to really start cranking. I really, really like my content. I like my bloviation on these podcasts. I even like the sound of my own voice. I record these in one sitting, just like I do one take video reels on TikTok and YouTube. I really like my creativity, whereas at this time, when I wrote Stilts, I was doubting every word that I wrote. I did not feel I had the validation to be a writer. And the reason I bring that up too is George did not help. All I needed was a nod or some kind of acknowledgement that I was on the right path, and I never got it from this story. And in retrospect, did it slow me down further? Was it a crushing blow that stifled my creativity, the expression of my creativity? Maybe, but that's just an excuse. If I really meant it, if I really felt self-validated, if I really felt that that was what I needed to do above all else, then I would have done it. The most salient characteristic of anyone successful in any field is resilience, is grit. You don't need to rely on an old man to tell you that what you're doing is good or bad, even if you're writing about the old man. And the search for validation with George and the rejection that it brought forward was exactly the same kind of abusive rejection and dismissal I got from my own father. So I ran away from my own father to go hang out with his friend from Budapest, and I got the exact same shit sandwich for exactly the same reasons. And what that tells me is I was running away knowing that I was being chicken shit about this stuff. I did not have the courage and wherewithal to face it and overcome it. And maybe I'm being a little bit harsh on myself, but I think it's accurate. But at the same time, maybe that catharsis was necessary for my own growth. People do this all the time. They say everything always happens for a reason, which I think is a load of BS most of the time. But when it comes to relationships where we make choices, mostly unconscious ones, to be with the people we're with, whether it's a lover or a business partner, or in this case, my father's childhood friend, we're doing it with an objective, an emotional objective. Again, we might not even know what that objective is, but we're going for it because we need to. And life isn't just the destination, but it's the getting there. And that's what I love most about this story and why I think it's popped up this Sunday morning, because it means so much. It means so much not only through the words of the story itself and the imagery and themes of the tale, but in the writing and most significantly in the rejection that I got writing it. Very important. Very, very important. And I would venture to assume that many folks would interpret this and be devastated forever. That I could have been this creative 30 years ago as I am now if guys like George didn't shit all over my work. That is bullshit. Again, I'm not blaming my younger self. I'm merely validating the universe, as it were. Yes, things are unfair. Yes, I was unfairly judged for what ostensibly is a great piece of writing, but that's on me. The universe, in a sense, was testing me at that point if I was worthy of being the writer that I sensed deep inside I already was. But I wasn't, because I took his criticism personally. And I think this is very important. not to mention absolving me of feelings of regret. I coulda, woulda, shoulda just gone on and kept writing at 90 miles an hour like I did writing this story at that time, as I'm doing right now, and then my whole life would be different. That's just not how it came to be. If you're familiar with my other stuff, I just published a science fiction novel focused on the multiverse. So if we do live in an infinite multiverse of infinite branching possibilities and their realization, then there's an infinite number of multiverses where at least this guy gave me a wink and a smile and said, good job. And then maybe in those universes, I would have continued writing with equal zeal, and I wouldn't be reading this on this Sunday morning, and I'd be doing something else. Maybe. But I'm in this universe, which is the fundamental theme of my novel. We're here. This universe. And it's actually pretty awesome, because I believe in those forces of karma, that we create our own destiny amid those infinite possibilities. And the destiny that I created for myself was to get punched in the face by his rejection, take it personally, and now read that story on this podcast and learn from it. So, booyah. What's also clear, enough about me, what about George? The story was about him, right? My rendering of his own story had clearly moved him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been such an asshole. One could argue that his implicit vindictiveness and lack of appreciation had more to do with vulnerability than jealousy. If nothing else, his criticism and rejection of my creativity reminded me of Kathy's own countless complaints about her dad growing up, enduring his criticism, his judgment, his wrath. And then all that made me think of my father again and his legacy of doing the same. And as I mentioned, bingo, that was the money shot here. George's asshole reaction to my art was what made me closer to my own asshole father. And then, as I mentioned, they were opposites, but complements of each other. Laszlo, my father, was tall. George was short, like really short. Laszlo was a master craftsman. He built furniture. He had a factory of furniture that he designed and manufactured, while George couldn't even screw in a light bulb. Laszlo was taciturn. George couldn't shut the fuck up. But both tried to destroy those whom they loved because deep down inside, they hated themselves. And as I mentioned, I've seen similar patterns in Holocaust surviving families. Victims victimizing their spouses, the sons and daughters of the vanquished. I've wondered if survivors like George and Laszlo would have become terrible people had they not endured childhood's horrors. Another counterfactual, another multiverse exploration. If George and Laszlo had not endured the horrors of the Holocaust and barely survived, would they have been nice guys? Who knows? Rather than judge them, I prefer to write about them. Now, you might think that writing about them automatically is judging them, but you decide based on this short story, how it was written, how I'm telling it. And as I mentioned, at the end, I'll share an addendum where I got feedback from Kathy, George's daughter, who read this story for the first time 30 years later. I published it on Medium and I shared the link with her, and I'll put the link in this podcast description. And that was as illuminating as the entire exercise. And I learned so much about George, about Kathy, about my own father, and yet again about myself in terms of what I tried to do, what I got back. And frankly, as ironic and paradoxical as it sounds, it's a gift that keeps on giving for the very reasons that the entire exercise was so maudlin and dysfunctional and frankly disheartening. And to me, that's the biggest takeaway of this entire exercise. If you land a huge success in life, then what have you learned except to perhaps do it again as you did it before to try to get the same results? But when you give something every ounce of your being and the universe's response is to slap you in the face, then the real lesson might not be in just the doing. It's not just in being a good writer, but it's in learning how that writing impacts those around you, and learning above all that the joy of creativity in and of itself is not only sufficient, but it's maximal reinforcement of the process itself. If you're a creator, create. And there ain't nothing that's going to stop you, because when you wake up on a Sunday morning, when other people are doing other things, you are doing your art, and that in and of itself, with zero additional qualification, makes you an artist and hopefully makes your content interesting to others because it came from the heart. So let's give this short story a whirl. Stilts, based on the life of my father's childhood friend. Her legs are long and lovely, a carriage of loveliness and life, flowing by me like the lines of the Danube River below. I watch her serve the other tables at this outdoor terrace cafe in Budapest, as efficient as she is beautiful, and am reminded of Sartre's observation that a waiter embodies the essence of himself entirely through the tasks he performs. A waiter, nothing more and nothing less than the action of taking orders and serving hosts. She dips, she sways, she serves the drinks and removes the empties. But to me, she is far more than her visible role as waitress, transcending even the stunning view of the graceful bridges that span the river, the gently rising hills of Buda, the royal palace of ostentatious gilt and filigree, and the fisherman's bastion with its neo-Romanesque parapets studded with slim, round turrets. She is love, she is life, she is the regeneration of my spirit, a fluid landmark able to heal the wounds of neglect and disrepair, denial and forgetfulness that blemish the rest of the war-torn buildings not found in the Baedekers. Yes, I am a tourist, a visiting foreigner in my own land. From the moment I opened the French doors of my stopover suite at the Bristol Hotel in Vienna and stepped out onto the balcony, I realized that I gazed down upon a different Europe from the world of turmoil I had left almost 19 years to the day. A teenager then, having been beaten bloody by Russian soldiers and stripped of everything but the clothes I wore for illegally crossing the border from communist Hungary into Austria, I had walked over 40 kilometers to the Rothschild Hospital. Debilitated, hungry, the city I found was hardly in better shape. The Second World War had ended, but its survivors lived in its haunting shadow, a civilization and its people brought to the very edge of extinction. But nearly 2 decades later, this bustling pedestrian mall of Kärtner Strasse below my balcony told a different story. As workmen perched high on scaffolds affixed to the gingerbread facade of the Vienna Opera House shared my view of the magnificent Sacher Hotel and the luxurious frivolity of Vienna in the 50s. Shiny new cars glided by in endless streams of traffic as elegant locals alongside jeans and sports shirt-clad tourists sipped at cappuccinos, lazily turned the pages of their newspapers, or punctuated animated conversations with forceful hand gestures as they cast appraising glances at the motley scene of passerby. In many ways, I stood there hardly distinguishable from most moderately successful American tourists of the day. I, an advanced degree professional with a wife and 2 children, living in an upper-class south suburb of Chicago in my custom-built home, resplendent with its obligatory dog and mortgage, having realized what in Europe they call still the American dream. I had come to Europe, like so many others, to gape at history and indulge in the pleasures of leisure and travel. But as the stubborn layer of soot and grime on the Opera House represented a lingering cultural melancholy, so did my own soul reminisce about my dark days as a survivor and refugee. And as I stood there above the throngs, the past apparently forgotten or meaningless to the comfortable faces of those lost to themselves and distraction, I could not bring into harmonious coexistence my own inner and outer worlds, for I felt neither here nor there, more like a being from another world, another era, the elevation and disconnection making me feel more like a visiting ghost than a redeeming angel. After a few such restless days in Vienna, I settled my bill with the concierge, got into my rented Mercedes convertible, and set out for my home city of Budapest. Crossing the still heavily armed border into Hungary, past the barbed razor wires, minefields, and watchtowers, driving by the grimacing machine gun-toting border guards, I tried to shake off the feeling of traveling back in time. I reached into my jacket and sought reassurance by touching, again and again, my American passport, as if my identity, suddenly sorely in question, could be found amid the multicolored stamps and pale blue paper. As the populous, prosperous Austrian countryside of neat, red-roofed brick homes and open vistas instantly transformed into gray, unpaved, dirty Hungarian villages and their poverty-stricken inhabitants, my feeling of dread and unease increased. I reached into my jacket yet again, but the blue booklet could no longer help me. I was on my own, a being with either too much history or not enough, a citizen of the world who found lasting comfort in none of its countries. And of all the places I could have visited, I was entering a threatening, dark, and humorless environment, a world I knew all too well, a world I once considered my home. Arriving in Budapest, I checked into the new Duna International Hotel, built by an Austrian and American consortium to Western standards of comfort and service. The hotel was an import, like myself, and the relative luxury and separation were soothing. The road journey and even my several days in Vienna had been tiring, and I looked forward to rest and the start of a new day. Traveling across oceans, continents, and countries is tiring enough, let alone traveling across the boundaries of time back to re-experience firsthand one's own past. The somber and sometimes austere buildings, the people and their interlaced cultures, all held a sense of fascination and dread, foreboding and expectation. I stood by the hotel room's window, this time gazing down upon the city of my birth. I felt disoriented, and in that disorientation began to question my reason for even returning. What could be found here? What value in returning to a land that held so much contradiction, so many painful memories? Vacations are meant to relax the working man, I thought, settle the nerves. Instead, I paced, had difficulty collecting and focusing my thoughts. I no longer reached for my passport. The photograph of the middle-aged American businessman I found there began to alarm me. I had become someone else, and that someone else had even less to do with this forgotten city of the dead. To calm myself, I stowed the luggage, sat down with a newspaper, and concluded that tomorrow would be a new day, would provide that chance to start afresh. Sleep was welcome and much needed, a chance to dream the dreams of a 19-year sleep. But I could not remember them as I awoke the following morning. "What can I serve you, sir?" She jars me from my reverie and offers an ambiguous smile to start, catching me doubly off guard. Tall, serving tray in hand, she towers above me, a gentle giant who awaits my order. Stunned by her youth, her pale, delicate beauty, as stunning when standing beside my table as only moments ago while shifting gracefully across the cafe, I hesitate, not having yet considered the options on the menu. I look to the other tables for direction, a shift of attention, but the early morning crowd is lost to the papers, the view, the fresh summer breeze. "What have you got?" is all I can get out as I turn to her, my eyes fascinated, my heart warming. I feel like a shy, girl-scared teenager. "Most anything you may wish," she says, her ambiguous smile strangely inviting with its eerie, enticing sense of recognition and invitation. "I will have one of your wonderful chestnut pastries and a drambuie, please," I say, trying to contain myself, unable to stop staring at her, the attraction subliminal in a way that I do not understand. She walks away, carried off by those long legs, and I appraise and appreciate her beauty as I would a cubist Picasso. The totality of her natural charm, the sight of her long, flowing brown hair, her oval face, her fair skin and enormous Sophia Loren eyes, her sculpted body and those timeless legs from afar, from near, and now far again, all juxtaposed in my mind and in my heart. These images combine, recombine, cancel, and enhance each other, all to create a montage of mood, memory, and feeling. Love is basically a simple emotion, immediate, compelled to flourish among the complexities of life and its great distances and many separations. Some have said that these trials and obstacles even heighten the emotion, that romance and erotica are driven by what you can't see, what you can't have, the many spaces between the lines. My first love, when I was 15, crossed these boundaries with an intensity and strangeness characteristic of those times of war and dissemination. She, along with her parents, actually moved into my family's apartment. What we lost in formality, we perhaps made up in convenience, youthful naivete, and the urgency of circumstance. For years, we had heard about the war, the sweeping military conquests of Germany. We had heard rumors about the vast suffering, the various atrocities perpetrated against civilian populations of the conquered countries. In Hungary, technically allied with the Axis, pragmatically enjoying a peaceful neutrality, we simply read the newspapers and went on with our lives. For nearly 4 years, the world was indeed at war. But when the fighting and suffering continued in distant lands, we could feign a benign, albeit slightly concerned, indifference. Like all those who luckily manage to escape the horrors of a war that surrounds them but somehow spares them, we considered the whole mess someone else's problem, their problem, so long as the troops weren't marching in formation down our own streets. A balmy, peaceful spring day in March of 1944 brought with the cool western breeze swastika emblazoned silver formations of bombers, swarms of Messerschmitt fighter planes in escort ripping across clear, crystalline blue skies. On the ground, tanks and armored personnel carriers rumbled across the cobblestone streets of Budapest, deploying thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers and their entourage. Our luck, along with our lives, instantly changed as our indifference turned suddenly to an active, fretful concern. Our greatest fear was realized. The shadowy paranoia materialized into actuality. The fighter planes indeed screamed outside our own windows. The march of jackboots clack, clack, clacked on our own narrow streets as armed German sentries stood in shocking detail outside our own doors. As their silver breastplates reflected the bright sun, the shining, stylized double lightning bolt on the collars of the SS uniforms sent an ominous message of the times to come. The tigers were released in a new part of the jungle, and they quickly sharpened their claws. In swift succession came edicts, ideology transformed into legislation that directly reordered our lives. To more effectively hunt their prey, the prey had to be clearly identified. Jews were commanded to wear yellow six-pointed stars clearly visible at all times, failure to do so resulting in immediate deportation to a concentration camp. To make the hunt more efficient, the prey had to be weakened. The Jews were prohibited to practice any of the professions, own businesses, attend schools, use public transportation, or be in the streets but for 2 designated hours each day. And to finalize the hunt, the prey had to be isolated. Jews were commanded to relocate into specified areas and buildings of the city. Entire square blocks of residents were forced to move within 24 hours, and were only allowed to take with them what they could carry. German officers, SS men, imported bureaucrats, and advisors expropriated the homes and possessions of these once proud citizens of Budapest. Within the allocated Jewish sections of the city, several families were compelled to occupy single apartments, often a dozen people to a room. For me, a brash, smart-assed 15-year-old, all was not too bad. My first love, living with her family in a forbidden area of the city, was conveniently enough forced to move directly into our apartment. Having her constantly near me without any of the unnecessary and distracting interruptions, such as work and school, was all very much to my liking. And since I'd always been somewhat of a rebellious, reckless daredevil, the class clown who distinguished himself more for his outlandish risk-taking than foolish buffoonery, I succeeded in distinguishing myself further by refusing to wear the mandatory yellow star, roaming the streets during any hour that suited me, running errands for family and friends, and even going to the movies well past the evening's curfew. I was too short for my age, and that was always a bother to me. It bothered me most because it seemed to bother others. The subject of ridicule, I always acted in such a way as to win over those who shunned or insulted me over my height. And if the Napoleon complex is characterized by overcompensation, then let it be said that at certain times in life, overcompensation can come in handy. In retrospect, many of my antics were indeed life-threatening and often unnecessarily foolhardy. But the innocence and naivete of youth can, in a time of crisis, be quite an asset. To my true love, the carelessness and merrymaking in the face of such danger were unparalleled acts of bravery, heroism, and manhood. And her enthusiasm for me and my boldness brought me rewards well beyond black market chocolate and late evenings at the Bijou with Humphrey Bogart. Needless to say, our pleasures were wonderfully enhanced by the ever-present danger and fear of discovery. Of course, my romantic and financial success enticed many of my closest pals from school to follow my lead. We fantasized ourselves renegades, American cowboys or their Indian savages, English detectives and the equally brilliant criminals they would pursue. We were international spies, merciless hooded assassins, brave lambs and weak predators, and most of all, cool-headed, hot-blooded adolescent romantics. We loved life because the chance of it being taken away was so great. We cherished everything we could get our grubby little hands on because we could get our hands on so very little. Of course, the frivolity and enthusiasm of youth tells one story, the raw statistics of war and genocide tell another. Of the 36 boys in our class, 11 would be able to tell tall tales of the good old days. For even during those harrowing opening days of the German presence, the time when 15-year-olds were forced to enter their 40s, we had yet to realize even remotely what was to be in store for us. Meanwhile, life went on, for it could not do otherwise. We figured that if smarts couldn't save you, then perhaps luck would. If luck failed you, then one could always pray. And if God forgot about you, well, perhaps by that time the war would be over or the Messiah would come, a revelation that, to us, amounted to essentially the same thing. For the time being, we were alive. We had our fun. Surrounded by enemies, we learned how to particularly value our friends. Being out of school in those days of the German occupation, however, had one drawback. I could no longer impress my good friend Carl. Very tall and slight of build, Carl's straw-colored hair fell straight over watery blue eyes set in an oval, colorless face. He walked as if he feared that with each step he was going to crush something fragile and delicate underfoot. His demeanor was a brew of timidity and apology, his speech stuttered, his locomotion awkward, such that his long, lanky shadow seemed more of substance than himself. Carl was the janitor's son in the building where my parents rented our third-floor apartment. Carl lived in a dingy one-room and kitchen basement apartment with his parents, his younger sister Lily, and his uncle Fred. The children slept on a grungy mattress shoved into the corner of the kitchen. His father, strangely enough, slept by himself on the ragged living room sofa, an oddity eventually explained by the then rather amusing discovery that Uncle Fred was no uncle, but shared Carl's mother's bed at the other corner of the room. Looking at Carl's father, one could instantly and effortlessly understand his tolerance of such a situation. I can remember him sitting at a makeshift stained wooden table in the kitchen, greasy suspenders holding his unbuttoned trousers over his rotund belly, his curled pipe permanently stuck in his mouth, as he stared forever silently into empty space through an impenetrable alcoholic haze. Carl's mother was a diminutive, quiet, and always melancholic woman with lush black hair worn in a long single braid, while her lover, Fred, was an enormous, strong-willed man, red in the face and short in his temper. Uncle Fred ruled his ersatz family with an iron hand, slow of praise but swift with his fists, a man of violent, uncontrolled temper who beat all offenders of his rules, including Carl's helpless, silent father. Carl and I grew up together in that apartment building, our age and proximity sustaining the friendship that we carried with us into our teens. Carl was quiet, extremely reserved, and always treated me with the deference due to my exalted social standing as a tenant's son. I was rather loud, brash, and highly energetic. Surprise, surprise. So our complementary personalities also reinforced our bond. We attended the same school until we were 10, when I went to a college prep school, and Carl became apprentice to a carpenter. Uncle Fred soon made him quit his apprenticeship to remain home and assist with the janitorial chores, but our friendship continued unaffected. In fact, our suddenly increased cultural distance ironically brought us even closer together. Every day when I came home from school, Carl would wait for me at the building's entrance, eager to hear of the exotic, new, and wonderful things I was learning. As I spoke to him of the Ottoman conquest of Hungary, of the writings of Plato and Aristotle, the poetry of Villon, and the ethics of Lin Yu Tang, I made sure to throw in lots of Latin and other foreign phrases, most of which I did not understand myself. His eyes wide with wonder, his body rigid with concentration, he listened with tremendous awe and enthusiasm to everything I had to say. These forays into pseudo-intellectualism with the janitor's son felt good. Small of stature as I was, I felt myself a giant in the eyes of this tall, thin Hungarian lad. But one aspect of our friendship caused me great alarm. Carl was actually a superb athlete. He could run, he could catch, he could outpace and outdistance all the neighborhood's children. Unfortunately for the equilibrium of a relationship based on inequality, I was, and remain to this day, woefully uncoordinated. The laughing stock on the playing field, I spent more time with the girls on the sidelines than proving my non-existent prowess between the white lines. Only Carl, my devoted, highly adroit friend, could, using his athletic clout by threatening to resign from the team, get me into a soccer game. But these were acts of a loyalty I considered my due. After all, I was the truly aggressive one. I was the one who convinced him that I read Schopenhauer, knew Euclid's axioms, could recite by heart Hungarian translations of Virgil, Dante, Milton, and Byron. And so, our status quo, however fragile before the merciless judgment of soccer ball and tennis racket, remained in a delicate balance. If not for the stilts. You're Drambuie, sir. Much like most of the women I find particularly desirable, she blends into woman, a universal pool of fascination, triggering feelings so intense and all-consuming that she seems oddly familiar to me. A lady, and every lady, every woman, back to Eve. In this case, perhaps only another lusty hallucination. But those eyes, that shape of her face, its pale skin, her shyness. I accept the drink and offer a toast. To memories of Budapest, I announce and raise my glass, perhaps a little too formally. To many more such memories, she bows, her legs again taking her away, this time seemingly against her will. I do not know how those stilts came into Carl's possession, but from the moment I saw, to my infinite distress, the already tall lad elevated more than a meter higher than usual. I knew that all the badly recited Victorian poetry in the world could not save me. To make matters even worse, when on his stilts, a strange, some would say magical transformation would take place. The shy, unsure, taciturn, and subservient janitor's son became a tower of strength, self-assurance, and decision. His bent posture straightened, his drooping chin suddenly held high. His whole demeanor became utterly transformed, as even the color of his eyes seemed to darken, turned from a watery blue to a crystalline opal glaze, his gaze fixed fantastically on the distant, otherwise invisible horizon. Up there on his stilts, Carl entered some fantastic and deeply personal realm. His mind transported beyond the stained brick walls, the silent flowing river, the careless suffering of this world. And when Carl fell into motion, I could do nothing but retreat before this monster, this wingless bird, this oddly majestic abomination, this matchless threat to my adolescent authority. Carl would sway expertly to the left, raise the jutting maple prosthetic limb, arch it forward and down, shift his weight onto the newly conquered territory, repeat the procedure to the right, propelling himself forward faster than I could run. He could walk around sewers and step onto sidewalks. He could stilt through his errands, walk up and down stairs. And with the lumbering determination of a Tyrannosaurus, with the agility of a lanky monkey, this alcoholic janitor's son utterly destroyed my congenitally low altitude sovereignty. Go on, to try them on, Carl said one day, holding the blonde coffin posts out for me. Having disembarked, his 2 feet once again squarely on the ground, Carl's old and much welcome self returned almost instantly after he removed those stilts. Our roles relearned, he therefore became sympathetic to my distress. He again paid attention to me. Go on, it's fun. You can do it. My dread was complete. Fully aware of the attempt's furious impossibility, my tattered pride compelled me to try them on anyway. Of course, I could not even stand in them, let alone walk. I would fall, and my anger would merely increase, pressing me to try yet again. I would fall again, my fury rising to a fever pitch, upsetting my concentration further, making it all the more impossible. Carl, superhumanly patient with the decency of his person, his social position, and his earthbound altitude, did not laugh. Shockingly enough, he coaxed, encouraged, made suggestions, tried to make me feel better. Furious not only by my failure on the stilts, but further by Carl's kindness, I exploded. This is nothing. You are nothing. I hate your damn gloating. I am better than you, simple as that, and you can't change anything by walking around on these goddamn stilts. But Carl said nothing, standing there with his eyes lowered to the ground until I exhausted myself yelling. Then he looked slowly, apologetically into my eyes and said, his stuttering at its worst, "You must not give up. Someday the time will come when you must get up on those stilts." Dumb, I observed. As dumb as you. What's that supposed to mean? That means nothing. Carl, embarrassed, shuffled away, his stilts dragged dejectedly behind him. I am sorry. We can try again some other time. The deportation of the Jews who lived outside of Budapest commenced early in the summer of 1944. Although eyewitness accounts of survivors and various rumors slowly circulating from town to town warned of the mass exterminations in Russia and Poland, Hungarian Jewry, up to the opening of their cattle cars to Auschwitz, lived in a steady and stubborn state of denial. By the 11th year of the Nazis' rise to power, the killing machine had reached its highest pitch of efficiency, a level of organization and effectiveness for which the Germans were always so well regarded. By the hundreds of thousands, the Jews of the Hungarian countryside were disappearing, while much like the previous several years of war, the Budapesters were enjoying a relative state of solace. The edicts remained in place and were tenaciously enforced, but an illusion of safety and the hope of an early end to the war reinforced the feeling that we would get out of the nightmare relatively unscathed. The rumors continued, the Nazi presence everywhere from the banks of the Danube to the outer provinces of Budapest were experienced daily. The drafting of males into labor services were a continued occurrence, but we were alive. My own group of friends and our immediate families were relatively unaffected, so our illusion of safety continued. But history proved infinitely more restless and unpredictable than an unknown 15-year-old's dreams and fears. Germany's Russian campaign had encountered a bad winter and unexpectedly tenacious troops with sophisticated armor. And by the following winter of 1944, the German army was in high retreat well beyond the borders of the Soviet Empire. Weakened by a vigorous two-front war, having already lost on the desert sands of Africa, the Wehrmacht swayed and relented at D-Day as the Allies successfully established bridgeheads on the northern beaches of France and were well on their way to the Rhine. With the Thousand-Year Reich considered a rum bet even throughout the Axis powers, allegiances were falling apart and regrouping, as Europe was already beginning to prepare itself for a post-war environment where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin would figure somewhat more prominently than Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito. For Hungary's regent, Admiral Miklos Horthy, the deal with the National Socialists was never quite to his liking. Historically, Hungary had always been the gateway to the Balkans, a strategic crossover point between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East for everyone from Attila to the Crusaders to the Turkish Muslims. Swept late into the Second World War, Horthy quickly found himself playing a delicate balancing act between appeasing the seemingly invincible Nazi military machine with its horde of Hungarian irredentist ultra-right radicals and maintaining at least the semblance of Hungarian autonomy. As that aura of Nazi invincibility began to crumble in the autumn of 1944, Horthy saw his chance to break with the Axis, declare Hungary's withdrawal from the feudal conflict, and perhaps expand his own sovereignty in the wake of the German retreat. Politically careless, tactically bumbling, and strategically inept, Horthy's plan for a coup on the morning of October 15th failed completely. Considered Hungary's darkest hour, not only did Horthy fail to establish his new pact with the Allies, but he was extradited to Germany and his co-conspirators were assassinated. In less than 24 hours, the Hungarian fascist party known as the Arrow Cross, or Nyilas, swept into power, ensuring not only Hungary's continued participation in the war, but a most untimely fate for the hitherto unscathed Jews of Budapest. Fostered by a culture accustomed to persecution and fear, we accepted our situation as merely another chapter in the long and arduous fight of our race. To that point, we had been passed over. But as the fears of German occupation materialized into physical reality, so too did our fears of systemic extermination. On the day following the thwarted coup, all Jewish males between the ages of 16 and 60, and all women from 18 to 55 were ordered to gather in the courtyards of their buildings to be marched off to labor camps. Forcibly separated from my love earlier that morning for what would be the very last time, I stood with my father out in the bitterly cold winter morning, waiting to be led away from our homes and into the throes of the final phases of what became known as the final solution. I desperately looked for Carl. Perhaps he could help me. Hide me. I found him, for I could not miss him, but he did not meet my searching eyes. He stood motionless on his stilts, high above the crowd. We labeled our problem anti-Semitism, much as those in power labeled it Jew. But when ideology and politics were reduced to their bare realization, the result translated to little more than neighbor hating neighbor, one conspiring to remove another if only to vent a capacity for hate and perhaps benefit financially. Our own neighbors were taking our homes and our belongings away, for we were already dead. Carl, consumed in his world beyond the horizon, seemed behind a veil more impenetrable than even the hatred or indifference of his kind. He was more removed than the Jews being taken away. He could do nothing for me or any of us then. I took one final look back into the world of the living, as the jackal-headed god in the guise of an Aryan face and SS uniform ushered me and everything I knew into the depths of the underworld. The march to our destination, an abandoned coal storage yard, took 2 full days. The weather, as if the otherwise silent God himself mocked us, turned even more bitter, a cold rain washing over us and causing steam to rise from our tattered clothing, ablaze with the hot perspiration of our exhaustion. As we marched further into the countryside, a thin layer of ice began to form on our exposed skin, a layer hardly thick enough to shield us from the fear, shock, and utter strain of our physical and emotional torture. The old and infirm who could not keep the pace were summarily taken to the side of the road and shot, their bodies littering the roadside like milestones between the concentric circles of hell. Our escorts, SS men accompanied by black uniformed Aerocross men and boys no older than myself, beat the laggards and generally relished our mistreatment as if, waiting months for the dam to break, they could now finally vent the full force of their sadism, justified by a culture of hate deeply ingrained within the lifeblood of a nation forever uncomfortable with itself. Arriving at the storage yard, we provided slave labor for the forces resisting the Russian advance. Fed a dark brew in the morning, a chunk of stale bread for lunch, a watery soup in the evening, we slept on the ground, exposed to the elements. We dug anti-tank traps, lines of trenches, gun emplacements amid the constant threat of beating, torture, and execution. When not forced to bury the dead, the graves were dug by the condemned themselves. Swept along by the rush of madness and fear, I can remember burying comrades alive, their bodies twitching as the black earth covered them, a shovelful at a time, their few possessions scattered at our feet, later stolen by the guards and gendarmes. We learned how to dig, and while we dug, we learned how to anesthetize all feeling. For when everything is stripped away, when one's dignity becomes as meaningless and futile as one's hope and enthusiasm for living, the raw instinct for survival takes its place, a mechanism that suspends every aspect of oneself that could be considered human, supplanting them instead with an animalistic drive to simply stay alive. After some weeks, we were told to gather our few remaining belongings and prepare ourselves for relocation to another camp. Sensing my imminent demise, I escaped. No heroics, no methodical calculation, no conspiracy. I turned left when the column turned right and made my way to a suburb where my gentle uncle lived with his Jewish wife and their daughter. He hid his check. Hello, hello, hello. Check. Hello, rest. I need a little coffee. He hid his wife and child in a hole in the ground underneath their bed. No room for me in such a comfortable crypt. I spent 3 days wedged in a small alcove between the roof and the attic floor, compelled to lie absolutely still, urinate on my fingers to keep them from being frostbitten. Unable to continue such an existence, I decided to risk it and set out in search of my family. Wandering the streets in the rags that were once my clothes, I was quickly picked up by a roving Aerocross patrol and turned over to the SS. Those who could work were put to work. In their barracks, I cleaned toilets, shined boots, and served as a moving target for their sharpshooting practice by popping in and out between the trees. After all, a war was going on, and the SS, well, they had to stay sharp. One night I was detailed to load freight cars with crates containing all manner of goods the Germans were shipping back to the fatherland. A crate filled with uniforms burst open. I found one that fit me, and with a quick change and exemplary Hi Hitler, walked away with impunity back into the streets of Budapest. For several days, I wandered about in my German uniform, making official haste in the presence of Germans and their sympathizers, sleeping in doorways and movie houses, scrounging for food wherever it could be found. One late night, near my former home, the street was suddenly blocked on all sides by military police searching among their own ranks for deserters. Terrified of detection, my charade suddenly ineffective, I approached my former apartment building. The building was eerily silent, mysterious, as if 100 years had elapsed since I'd last set eyes on it. The gates were locked after 10 in the evening, and anyone who wished to gain admittance was forced to ring the janitor's bell. The janitor would then come to the front and open the gate for a salutary nickel or two. I prayed for Carl to be on duty that fateful night. My luck held. He was as surprised as I. What are you doing here? He stuttered. What are you doing in that uniform? Let me in, Carl, was all that I had time to say as I squeezed past him into the courtyard. Please, Carl, they are asking everyone for their papers out there, and if they catch me, I am dead. Please, you must hide me. I won't be around for long, I promise you. He looked at me silently for a few seconds and then motioned for me to follow him. He stealthily led me through the courtyard, into the building, and into the building's enclosed elevator. Without a word, he reached up, opened the overhead hatch, and pointed. Rather familiar by now with the logistics of such a situation, I instantly complied and with Carl's assistance was hoisted through the hatch and out onto the roof of the elevator. You must be very quiet, Carl said, peering up at me in the darkness. For the first time in our relationship, my vantage point was physically above his, but I could hardly relish the wonderment of my superior elevation. Uncle Friend is in big with the arrow cross now, and if he finds you, you will be shot instantly. As he was about to close the hatch, he thought for a moment, reached up, and held my hand tightly. I will bring you a blanket and some warm food when I can, but in the meantime, remember, please be very quiet. All night long, I rode that elevator up and down the 5 stories of that building. First, I sat closer to the corner, away from the greasy mechanism and thick screeching wire, then tried to lie down, only to be jarred by the sound of muffled voices, the grinding of gears, the incessant fear of discovery. I waited for Carl, but Carl did not come. Woken again by the morning's traffic, sleep was impossible as throughout the day. Hungarian soldiers, Arrow Cross, and a miscellaneous civilian entourage of those who had taken away our apartments rode that elevator with me, up and down, down and up, an ironic ritual for a teenager so obsessed with his vertical position in life. Late that evening, I heard the hatch being opened, and with great relief, then heard the whispering voice of Carl. Here is some hot soup, he said. You must leave very soon, as my uncle is already suspicious. Do you hear me? You don't have much time. The evening followed much as the last, as did the following day. Around the same time that night, I again heard the sounds of the hatch, huddled tightly in a corner, and was again given life. But as I gazed down to accept his welcome offering, I noticed that his usually pale face was red and swollen, his lip cracked and bloody. He had a black eye. Carl, what happened to you? I got into a fight with some Nazi punks, was his terse answer. But you have to go right now. Do you understand? You must leave immediately. Is it Fred? I wanted to know. Amazingly enough, Carl grew irritated with my question and spoke with a tone and degree of self-assertion that I had never heard. Don't ask any questions. You must leave. You must go now. Carl, my friend, listen to me. The streets, I don't know if they are safe. Carl, please check them. I don't know if safe or not, you must leave. I can't be responsible anymore for what happens to you. I can't risk you being here any longer. Go now. I will pull you down and carry you out of here. As I climbed down into the elevator, I felt the familiar rage and frustration of again having to look up into Carl's face. But this time I didn't bother. Of course, you can't be responsible for me because I was the one always responsible for you. And do you know why? Because you were nothing then as you are nothing now. You can put your stilts on with your arrow cross friends, you Nazi bastard. I don't need you. I can take care of myself. Goodbye, Carl whispered as I walked out by the front gate without another word. As I scampered away, the anger quickly subsided and was replaced by nothing, the void of no feeling offered by the camps, the dead, the savagery that had become such a part of daily existence. This instance was simply another in a string of shocks, as my tolerance had risen to the point of dead calm. Friendship, betrayal, trust, abandonment, these words no longer carried any meaning. The only two commodities were life and death, and when it came to decision, when it came to action, the choice most people made for was life, even if it entailed death for someone else. Carl obviously was no different. How is your pastry, sir? I gazed down slowly at the delectable Hungarian specialty, looked back at her and shrugged self-consciously. Not having noticed her place it on the table, I have not had a chance to try it. Just admiring its beauty. You have a peculiar taste if you consider chestnut pastries attractive. She winked. I didn't say attractive, I said beautiful. You, madame, are both beautiful and attractive. Must be the food. The fine line between the living and dead was haphazardly and often randomly crossed during the war. Those who survived could live to remember how they might have come to remain among the living, while the stigma of those chosen to persist is an uncomfortable, open-ended inner conflict, perhaps more difficult to reconcile than the very finality and silence of death. We ask ourselves in one way or another every single day, how did I make it when so many others perished? And much like the mystery of death itself, such questions remain unanswerable. The associated guilt, longing, and forgetfulness merely a host of emotional defense mechanisms, a way we have of being able to address with the heart those problems the mind can never fully comprehend. With the first few months of 1945 came the time that was, for many years, referred to as the Spring of Freedom. The January siege and subsequent liberation of Budapest by Russian troops, the ensuing raping, pillaging, and marauding by our liberators, all finally behind us, the first tentative steps of building and rebuilding of life had begun. With the sense of spring came a new vitality, a rebirthing and rejoicing by those who had escaped the maelstrom. Never before had been able to recognize one of my fellow Jews while passing them on the street, but after the war, a casual nod of the head, an imperceptible glance, or even a slight smile affirmed the common bond shared by a very few. We survived in spite of it all. We won and we lost. We were those chosen from amongst the chosen. We were, and we are, but we will never truly be again. From the time I first received an allowance from my father, it had been my custom to buy some of the first violets of spring for my mother. Walking along the resuscitated boulevards, resplendent in my fresh new clothes, my belly full, I stole glances at my reflection in the shop windows. I noted with considerable delight that not only had I indeed survived, but that I had grown a little, not by much, but the change was there, was visible for the world to see. A cool, pleasant wind kicked up, a faint rustle of budding leaves on trees, the trilling sounds of birds greeting the arrival of the recurring spring, all fused into a musical ode to life and the living. I felt strong and quite grown up. And as if often the case with grown-ups, the flowers in my hand were no longer for my mother, but for my new love. Turning the corner to the street where she lived, I bumped into a diminutive woman. Startled by the inadvertent collision, we stood silent for a while, staring at each other. Finally, I managed to force some words through my choked-up throat and trembling lips. "Hello, Mrs. Hagelman. How are you?" "Thanks to the good Lord, I am all right. So good to see you, to see that you have made it. Are your parents and your sister equally fortunate?" She did not look into my eyes. I had the feeling that she wanted to cut the conversation as short as manners would allow. "We are all okay. I, too, wish to be on my way. I could not forget how Carl, once my friend but always her son, had thrown me out into the streets, how when the chips were down, Carl only cared about himself and his own safety. I found it hard to pretend that I cared anything at all about her and her family. Where are you going?" I continued, changing the subject. "To visit Carl's grave." She stared down at the ground. "Not really his grave, actually more like the place where he died." And with a nervous laugh of the distressed, "There was not enough left of him to bury." She slowly looked at me, her once sad eyes now totally devoid of all expression. "But you are a handsome young man now, and that is all for the good. Come and see us sometime." For a fleeting moment, I wanted to offer her the violets, but something held me back. I did not want to be a hypocrite. After all, there may not be much justice left in the world, but the ball does bounce right every once in a while. Carl Hagelman was dead, and I was alive. "I'll come and visit. Say hello to everyone for me," I blurted out as I got on my way. Of course, I had absolutely no intention of reestablishing any contact. The book was closed. The judgment decided. That the verdict was in my favor was quite to my liking. I would have been a fool to even for an instant think otherwise. As I wait for her to return to my table with the bill, I practice various opening gambits, rejecting one after another as juvenile, unimaginative, lascivious, or simply stupid. I'm an older man from a different world, but a vacation is a vacation, a chance to vacate one's problems, the world left behind, vacate oneself. What could be wrong with having a drink, taking in a show? After all, this is my country, my home. What better way for my lingering unease and compulsive sentimentality to find a more enjoyable outlet? And who better to share such loveliness with than the loveliness before my eyes? She approaches, her legs carrying her like a flowing white swan over crystalline waters. She smiles her smile and places the bill on my table. Thank you very much, sir. And you have a good time in Budapest. That would be guaranteed if I could have more of your wonderful smile, I say, laying it on rather thickly. Are you doing anything after work? Yes, as a matter of fact, I have plans for tonight. I will be having dinner with you. Now, my own smile is rather enigmatic, disconcertion taking command as I reel with disbelief from my sudden good luck. Perhaps returning to Budapest was a good idea after all. She sits down next to me and gently holds my hand. You don't recognize me, do you? My confusion is now almost paralyzing. I recognize beauty when I see it, is my inane try at wit and sophistication as I make a vain attempt at hiding my confusion. And with a look that borders on humoring a not too bright child, she succeeds in surprising me yet again. Our attraction is of a different nature, I would think. I am Lily, Carl's sister. With these softly spoken words, a delectable dream collapses, an unwanted brooding memory taking its place. If I was mocked in this city then, I am hearing those echoes this morning. Of course, I had no choice but to accept our mutual invitation. Later that evening, I sit next to her in the garden restaurant of the Citadel. The world-famous bridges spanning the Danube, the Parliament building, and the promenade on the banks of the river, all caressed by soft amber lights, my inner glow heightened by the soft touch of a delicate wine. I keep wishing that she were not Carl's sister. We struggle to get past the forced and unnatural conversation of two with common remembrances of a lost childhood who now sit face to face after an immense span of time, a spatial distension across an ocean both literal and figurative. I tell her about the days after the war, about my emigration and life in America, aware all the while that I might as well paint a picture of life on Mars for all the meaning I can convey. She, in turn, describes her life under communism, the hardships faced by Hungary and its people in the many turbulent years following the war. But we both know that we are delaying the inevitable moment when the real reason for sharing the evening can no longer be avoided. After our empty espresso demi-tasses are cleared away and the gypsy musicians move on to another table, she turns and looks at me with an intense, pensive, sad look. Do you ever think about Carl? I try not to. Why? She prods. Because it doesn't matter. Did it matter ever? No, not really. I wish to close the subject before we begin it. But her urgency demands a more polite close than silence. What he did to me then, he did at a time and under circumstances when life did not have the same meaning as it does now. Particularly not someone else's life. He looked out for himself, as did most everyone. My breath comes short, uneven gasps, and I am surprised to feel her sadness diffuse into my own soul. In a way, though, I owe him something. He, more than anyone else, taught me a valuable lesson. That when the going gets rough, you should count only on yourself. Life is too short to worry about the many options available to us. What we should and shouldn't do, we all simply do, and hope for the best. Things are hard enough as they are. You are so hardened, she says, staring down at the table. You lived yet what you have learned, fuck. Check. You are so hardened, she says, staring down at the table. You lived, yet what have you learned from your experiences? I'm sorry, Lily, I sputter. Perhaps returning to this torrid city was indeed a bad idea. Women are always harbingers of trouble for me. I should know better by now, but I never learn. Whatever he was your brother and he is dead. I apologize. I had no right to carry on like this. Could we talk about something else? Visibly shaken, she fights to regain her composure. She lights a cigarette, inhales deeply, her voice now calm, her expression benign. Deep down inside, you are a nice man. I knew it then, I know it now, but you are obviously bitter and cynical. Hurt will do that to you. What I'm going to tell you is not for Carl's sake. My brother does not need defense nor forgiveness. But you need to hear what I must say. She stares somberly into my eyes. I owe it to Carl to say it, and you owe it to yourself to hear it. The second night after Carl hid me in the elevator, he was caught by Uncle Fred. Late that evening, Fred had woken up and noticed Carl had made warm soup, methodically spooning it into a pot. What's up, Jew lover? Fred growled at him. The epithet was attached several weeks before then, when Carl tried to protect a 60-year-old man from being beaten to death by Fred. The man had returned to his apartment to fetch some of his books, taken along with his home and other possessions. Nothing, Carl said, just hungry. Carl ate the soup in silence, only to make another pot hours later and carry it into the night. But the following evening, Fred caught him again and instantly sensed what he was trying to do. You stinking Jew-loving bastard, I know you are up to something. Are you hiding one of your Jews? With that, he repeatedly and ruthlessly hit Carl in the face with his fists. Carl said nothing. He just stood there, not even trying to escape the blows. His nose broken, his lips bleeding badly. His mother tried to shield him and was beaten badly in turn. When the beating stopped, Fred went to the closet and put on his black fascist uniform. I'm going to get my men. When I come back, we are going to search this goddamn house from the cellar to the roof. Don't worry, Jew lover. I will find the vermin you are hiding. And you see this gun? You can justify your hunger for late night snacks by shooting the pig yourself. The call was no bluff. Uncle Fred went out into the streets for his men. Carl and I had little time left. For what seems an eternity, Lily and I sit silently, hurled back into another time, a history that has retold itself. As the import of her words hit home, I feel that I have been retold, recast, not with knowledge and memories, but with ignorance and forgetfulness. I tell her about my times after last seeing Carl, forced into revisiting the labor camp, fleeing from the Russians, the many months spent in displaced person camps set up by the Red Cross in Germany following the war, and my early years in the States. She listens attentively, but waits for something. How did Carl die? I ask finally. The old major sat on the damp cellar floor, leaned against the wall, and laid his rifle across his outstretched legs. He looked at the 4 boys left from the 12 with which he started his platoon. He wondered if any of them would make it much longer. The mortar attacks and house-to-house fighting was taking its toll, and hedged in by the Soviet forces, their backs to the river, the end could not be far. The boys were young, not one of them over 17. He worried about their fate and grieved for the others who already met theirs. But mostly the old major worried about Carl. Not that Carl did not do as he was told, it was just that he seemed so different from the others. He was a loner. He did not join in the camaraderie of the conflict, did not share the nationalistic, anti Semitic zeal of his compatriots. Come to think of it, the old major mused he could not remember seeing Carl ever fire a shot. What good was a soldier who didn't shoot? What good was a fight that could not be won? The old major was growing wary. His experiences in the trenches of Belgium and France from the First World War were reminders not of tactics and persistence, but futility and loss. Still, they all had their mission, and deserters had less of a chance than the men on the front. As the old major began to doze off, his thoughts drifted to his civilian life. He dreamed of the many horses he tended, the cozy corner of the stable he made his home. He could almost smell the comforting scent of hay, the aroma of the leather tacks, the familiar, comfortable smells of the barn, ever different with the changing seasons. Occasionally, he regretted not having a wife, settling down with a family of his own. But then there were plenty of girls who were willing and ready for him, girls who, for a ride in one of the landlord's fancy carriages and a bottle of wine, could satisfy him at least for that evening. But he missed not having children the most. He absolutely adored children, their innocence, their sincere smiles and laughter. He never failed to carry some candy, some fruits or cookies to hand out to the children of the other farm workers. He could not spend enough time with the children except for the master's own young boy and girl. As he felt warm and invigorated with the other children, he felt humiliated and confused, doffing his hat and bowing to the spoiled pair as they rode past him on their fancy rigged ponies, dressed in their brightly colored, ostentatious and indulgent riding clothes. With one of the house servants in attendance, the master's little girl would point, the little boy would laugh, and the old major would return to stables and hay that suddenly smelled more of shit than summer. These two were different in dress, in speech and manner from all the other children around. They looked at him with scorn and ridicule when all the other children treated him with fatherly love and respect. He knew that this was so because they were Jews. The old major didn't know or care much about politics. He fought in the First World War out of love for his country, fueled by a fierce spirit of nationalism his old age had not lessened. He was proud to be a Hungarian and a Catholic, and he knew that when he would again be called to serve, that he would do so out of personal devotion and a sense of loyalty to his homeland and its people. As the new order settled over occupied Europe, an evening in a tavern became an experience of ideology and indoctrination. One such evening, a fascist leader spoke of how the Jews sucked out the lifeblood of the Hungarian people, how with chicanery and cunning the Jews sought to destroy all that was precious to a true Hungarian. These words did not really mean very much to him. The old major was indeed a true Hungarian, and he felt that no Jew could ever take that away from him. But when the leader spoke of how the Jews looked down on all true Hungarians, how they ridiculed them and insulted them, how they considered themselves to be so high above them, he knew that this politician in black told the truth. And that truth was proved each time the little Jew brats rode by on the horses he tended with such care. Never a word of thanks, any attention or token of their appreciation or acknowledgement. He would then almost cry, sensing what would happen to his beloved country and to all that he loved if these Jews continued to flourish, if something wasn't done to stop this snobbery, presumptuousness, and racial poisoning. A blast of icy wind shook him awake from his light slumber. He instinctively reached for his rifle and pointed at the small, backlit, A blast of icy wind shook him awake from his light slumber. He instinctively reached for his rifle and pointed it at the small, backlit figure standing at the top of the stairs leading into the dark cellar. The 6 or 7-year-old boy was shaking from the cold. He pulled his thin, frayed coat, emblazoned with a yellow felt Star of David, tighter around his chest. He hesitated a moment, frightened by the sight of soldiers, but lifted up his courage and spoke. "Excuse me, but have you, sir, seen my mama? We used to live here, you know, but now I am lost and I cannot find her." Getting no reply, he started to cry softly, "Please, please, sir. Please, sirs, help me find my mama." The old major's expression did not change. The bullet he fired into the boy's chest was his only response. Instantly collapsing from the impact, the boy tumbled violently down the cellar stairs. Blood oozing from his mouth, he stared with glassy eyes at the ceiling. A couple of the young soldiers laughed. One remained silent while Carl rolled up his overcoat, walked to the boy's body, and placed the makeshift pillow under the boy's head. He kneeled down, gently touched the boy's face, and with sudden determination stood. To the wonderment of his platoon, Carl then picked up some discarded 2x4s, a hammer, and some bent nails, sat next to the boy, and began to make stilts. His voice barely a whisper, he stopped his work for a moment and said to the dead boy, "Just hang on, little fellow. You see, I will find your mama. I just have to make these stilts. When I stand on them, I can see very far, and I have magic powers. Then I will take you to your mama." Carl finished the stilts, and the amazed platoon continued to watch him, following up the steps and out of the cellar. Carl placed the ersatz stilts into the snow and expertly stood up on them. At the sound of the whistling of the incoming mortars, the rest of the platoon suddenly scattered and dove for cover. Carl, on his stilts, was already transported to his magical world. Whether he ever heard or even sensed the mortar that blew him apart, we will never know. The first rays of the dawn cast yellow-orange beams over the hills of Buda by the time I say goodbye to Lily. The Citadel restaurant long abandoned, the Danube stirring majestically, calmly below. Her story is wound like the silent river through the night, the waters and the light ushering in another summer day in Budapest. She stands, and a touch of our hands conveys a sense of thankfulness and eternal farewell. Although I have been to Hungary many times since then, I have never looked her up. I am growing old now and remain a tourist, a fancier of the intimate coffee houses and fine wines along the Danube. People say you get shorter in old age, but I have yet to try on those stilts. Perhaps someday I will feel that I no longer need them. I hope you enjoyed this short story. It was moving to me to read it. And I think I understand myself, certainly George, and my father a whole lot better for doing so on this Sunday morning. I shared this story through the Medium blogger platform where I've reposted it. Again, the link is in the notes below if you want to read it yourself. I shared this Medium post with Kathy, George's daughter, and her reactions were interesting and also worth sharing here, I think. She had bittersweet feelings learning more about what happened to her father during the war. On the plus side, she was moved by these arduous, often near-death experiences. In some ways, these details make me feel a bit more caring for him, she said. Maybe even forgive him a little, but not much. As I mentioned, Kathy had a contentious relationship, one might say, with her father, akin to my own contentious relationship with my own. QV, Holocaust survivors, their families, sons and daughters, their parents, cross-generational trauma, and I would dare say the archetype of the Eastern European asshole male. And I would also suggest that separating all of these factors is challenging, to say the least. Now, on the negative side, all of these unknown revelations reminded her how telling them would have required him to actually speak to her while she grew up, which was sadly not something he felt compelled to do. And again, mirror, mirror, my father was the same way. He did open up to me a little bit. I have some transcripts of his conversations, which I need to edit. I will post those on Medium too, and then write stories, no doubt. But I can relate to her 100,000%. Now, my choice of using the first person also threw her off. Not only did the narrator's voice not sound like her father, but the disconnect between the person telling the story and the story about whom it was told made her question the accuracy of the events and people described. Specifically, Kathy asked if the concurrent narrative meeting Carl's sister was true or if born of literary license. I responded, first expressing the hope that I didn't offend her in any way by sharing the story, especially since I did so through the lens of an introduction that wasn't exactly flattering to either of our fathers. I was quickly relieved that she had no problem with bringing the story back to light and making it public in the manner that I chose. So that was definitely a relief. I shared all this with her post hoc, and by post hoc, I mean 30 plus years. Kathy also didn't mind my references to her in the setup, which now makes me comfortable sharing her overall reactions here, and not only in the blog post, but in this podcast. So there you have it. Getting any possible upset or misunderstandings out of the way, I mentioned to her that I appreciated her feedback that the narrator didn't sound at all like her father, and her observation that reading a biography as if it were an autobiography was odd and sometimes confusing. I then explained my reasons for telling the tale of her father in the first person, including trying to heighten its emotional intensity and tell the story in what I thought at the time would be the most compelling and literary way possible. She interpreted the story as being about her father. Instead, I created her father as a kind of archetype and tried to universalize his travails as expressions of the broader human condition. So I was writer guy here. I started with notes, most of them just by memory, of George telling me all these stories. So everything in this story was as George told me. Was I there? No. Do I know them to be objectively, air quote, true? I don't know. I don't know now. I don't know. I didn't know then. But I didn't make any of these instances up. I provided some poetic flourishes. I recast his storytelling within this continuous narrative. I did intermittent flashbacks. I wove several strands together. And once again, the goal was to make it a great short story. And in the roman à clef style, the key to the story is the emotion, is the lived experience. In this case, not mine, but George's, seen through that lens. And whether it worked or not, that was the approach I took. And I understood that apparent disconnect between her father's third-party source material and me in the guise of a first-person narrator would make Kathy and presumably George question the truth of the story itself. And then I reiterated that my own recollection that every biographical detail shared throughout the tale was told to me in person by George. So based on a true story that I heard. And again, I couldn't vouch for their objective truth. I was never there. He was the sole unsubstantiated subjective witness. But far as I recalled, the story in its entirety, along with the parts about Carl's sister, meeting Carl's sister in this random encounter especially, were all as I heard them. In factual essence, but here's the thing, if not in style. That all said, her thoughtful feedback got me thinking about her own father's feedback to the same story 30 years ago. As I mentioned in the intro, I interpreted George ignoring the tale, and then when pressed, telling me essentially that it sucked, as another expression of his narcissistic and abusive behavior. George, as I mentioned, was an asshole, as was my own father. No holds barred. If there's a descriptor, people are complicated, but that's a really good one. Very accurate. As Kathy said to me, my father had to be superior in all things. He likely didn't like that you did it, and he didn't do it. And it's simple as that. I never thought, though, that the way the story was written might have alienated or offended him. And Kathy's point about the delta between her father's voice and that of the narrator brought this possibility to light. Did George feel I had stolen his agonizing youth only to repackage it as a vanity writing project? Did he feel that he was reading someone else's interpretation of his own life, the characters and events on point, but the experiences described, however accurate, disingenuous, and self-serving, namely serving me, not him? Was he dismissive and contemptuous not because the good writing made him jelly and gave him another opportunity to shut down someone who threatened him, but because I had offended and taken advantage of him? George long gone, I'll never know for sure. My guess is, like usual with a person like George, like with people in general who are complicated and selfish and often mean, the answer is all of the above. The story was well written. It's a good story by any stretch of the imagination. That's one thing I take away rereading it on this podcast. I'll talk about some of its strengths and weaknesses from my point of view in a second for what it's worth. But basically, George is gone. My dad is gone. And I'll never know. And that uncertainty belies any lingering doubt I have that either him or my father would have been better people had they not endured the Holocaust. As I mentioned, and I'm intimating and kind of stressing with the themes of the story, some people learn from history, their own and the world's, and strive to do whatever it takes not to repeat it, while others double down, instead making others suffer because they have suffered, seeking solace and knowing that they weren't the only ones that had to go through hell. Kathy, when I shared this, thought similarly. Other people went through horrible things and they weren't assholes. Despite all that, my father still chose to be one. So that's on him. And I'll, again, say the same thing about my dad. My dad had arduous experiences. I've related some of them on this podcast, in other writings, and I know I'm going to dive in even deeper because it's juicy, juicy, juicy stuff. Amazing. But other people had it even worse. I mean, it's always relative. And those who had it even worse, well, I don't know what they were like as fathers, as friends, as colleagues. But my father and Kathy's father chose to be the people that they are. Or did they? Maybe they, like everyone else, are just the way they are. Even more reason not to be judgmental, especially in retrospect like this, and especially when their stories are so juicy from an artistic point of view. Everyone loves the character. Think of your favorite movies. My favorite movies have no likable people in them, but they're great. Drama, personalities. In heaven, as David Byrne sang, nothing ever happens. That Kathy's father and my own chose to be assholes, or simply were assholes, is simply how the dice rolled. Children can't select their parents, nor can parents select their children. All any one of us can do is live the best life we can, live the life we love. For me, reminiscing and writing brings this joy, as does podcasting. I love this. This is a great Sunday morning, folks. I hope you're enjoying it whenever you're listening. The wonderful irony here is that the harsher the memories, the better the writing. The less likable or the less nice the people in a movie, in a play, the more compelling the drama. Maybe that kind of describes and maybe even explains most of the human condition, precipitating cataclysms like World War II and the Holocaust. Everyone really is kind of shitty. I mean, if you think about it, that sounds rather negative. But think about your own friends, your own family. Use a little bit of empathy and imagination and put them in World War II Europe. Think about it. Think about how selfish most people are, as objectively as you can. I'm not letting myself off the hook, nor should you. But think of the pettiness of most human relationships and then dial it up to exponential Spinal Tap turned to 11 levels of existential crisis. Troops in the streets, people starving, genocidal mandate, ultimate control over a minority or minorities, death all around you. How would your own colleagues, friends, and family react? How would you react? That's a tough question. I like to pick on LinkedIn as the social media platform of my greatest contempt. I mean, just scroll through LinkedIn. Such a vanity fair. How would those people react under these conditions? Well, not to pick on LinkedIn, humorously enough. Not to pick on anyone I know, anyone I don't know. But people have not changed for millennia, longer than that. Do you think they're any different now? No. Do you think they'll be any different in the future as we know it? No. So we need to, I think, curb our judgment. Not to forgive, certainly not to forget, but simply to understand. And I sense deep down in the heart of all this, there's its own social Darwinian instinctive logic. We made it this far, not in spite of these horrific human characteristics, but because of them. I believe that, and that doesn't make me jaded, I don't think. It, more than anything else, makes me understand people better. I used to feel so blindsided and bludgeoned by how harsh things were and are. Just hard to find a job, hard to find a mate, hard to relate to other people. How many deep relationships do we really have where we fess up, where we confide in others? You could share a bed with someone for 30 years and not know who the hell they are. What about the secrets you keep from the people closest to you? What about the secrets you keep from yourself? Think about how utterly, crushingly alone we are. Think about the frivolity of most social interaction. Think about the callousness and insensitivity of most hierarchical power situations, politics, business. Think about how difficult it is to partner with anyone in business, romantically. Think about the conflicts in families. We take all this for granted. We wake up every morning with this Pollyanna kind of veneer over everything, but it really is, as William S. Burroughs mentioned, a naked lunch. When you really look at what's on the end of your fork, it's not pretty. When you really look at your own life and the relationships of most people in your life, it's not pretty, but it's universal. It's archetypal. It's how it's always been. It's how it is now. And it's how it likely will be into the indeterminate yet predictably savage future. Now, we could wear different lenses when we look at human society and our lives, but with age, I'm getting more realistic, less innately Pollyanna. Hope for the best, expect the worst is inverted into expect the worst and don't even think the best is even likely, let alone possible. And again, that sounds very defeatist and fatalistic and negative, but I think it's accurate. I sometimes look back in my life and the regret isn't these branches, such as this story when George essentially told me to shove this short story back up my ass. How might my life be different had he told me otherwise? How might my life be different had I expected the inevitable result that followed from pouring my heart and soul into the story that was then summarily rejected? If you look at anyone, as I mentioned, who is successful in life, these things don't bother them. You got to keep your eye on the prize. So whether your eye on the prize is focused on making a lot of money or having a lot of sex or traveling the world, I think in my case right now, it's creating great content and going back through the tens of thousands of words and pages that I've written, continue to crank new content out that I love, where I've really found my sense of self and identity. And I can't help but, and here's part of the takeaway, I can't help but connect that to the realization that's very Schopenhauer-like. Do you say Schopenhauer-esque, Schopenhauerian? Schopenhauer felt that the critical state, or you'd say like the ground state of all human experience, is this sense of angst and disappointment that I'm relating to you now. That sooner or later relationships break down, that everything might start with high hopes and then degenerates into this kind of maudlin emotional entropy. And I'm agreeing with him. And once again, not to be a Debbie Downer, but just to be realistic. And if there's any learning from all this, is just not to be selfish and greedy and shit all over everyone else, but just be realistic about how people are. And you do you, baby. Do what makes you happy. Take risks. Damn the torpedoes. Full speed ahead. Be yourself. The universe put you here. Ride that momentum. And don't suffer from the Pollyanna illusion that this horribleness is just happening to you. Because with that, there's an inherent feeling of narcissistic uniqueness and specialness. if you think that you're being abused or mistreated, and that abuse or mistreatment is an anomaly, then you're smoking something funny. And I think I was smoking something funny for a long time. It's ubiquitous. And to get the most out of life and to best realize your own potential, you acknowledge that baseline. You don't fight it. And sure, there's great relationships and wonderful friendships and great times to be had. But seriously, the older you get, the wiser you get. You come to the realization of the universe's and humanity's own DNA, own logic, own way of going about doing things. And what pops out of that are wars and greed and suffering and selfishness. But as an artist, I gotta say, that's where all the good stuff is. So call it a cop-out, a rationalization, but this is the food for great writing, great ranting. Thanks for listening. More stories to come. I'm curious what you think of this story, and I'm just so blessed to be able to bring it to life on this Sunday morning. Like, comment, share. Stay tuned to more No Hair, All Heart. So just for the sake of completeness, how do I feel about the short story itself from a purely literary criticism point of view? How does the story hold up? What would I do differently? All that. Well, after all these years, I think the story, as I mentioned, is pretty damn good. From an editorial point of view, I think it goes a little bit over the top in areas. It could probably be a little bit more succinct, not only in terms of minimizing descriptions, but perhaps even heightening emotional impact, some dramatic tension. It reads almost like a novella rather than a short story per se. I tend to throw everything I got into these projects. My new science fiction novel, you could arguably say the same thing. I like to be indulgent. I like to dial it up to that 11 and have fun with it. Would the final product be better from some aesthetic or objective standard if I would be more succinct? If I would conscientiously try to reduce rather than add? I think so. But I also like some of its indulgence. I like the historical context. I like the oscillation between George with Carl's sister and then George in the throes of his own story. In retrospect, I might have done a slightly better job of bridging these jumps. But to me, at least, it seemed self-evident when I did ricochet back and forth. I could have italicized the flashback, could have massaged the segues with a little bit more finesse. But it's all good. It's not like I'm going to necessarily revisit this story from an editorial point of view. I'm certainly not going to write a sequel. And I continue to learn. And I think I continue to get better as a writer. And again, as I mentioned in the introduction and the follow-up now, When I wrote this, I was arguably trying so hard that the output conveys a little bit of trying too hard. But more power to me. I think it reads well. Some parts of it are a little forced, a little bit cliche. And I've come a long way, baby. But I'm proud of it. I think that the story was a terrific accomplishment at the time. And once again, I think that George's reaction reflected that, ironically enough. If the story really would have sucked, he would have joyfully pounced on it. I just don't think I gave him enough rope to hang either one of us. And I'm sure that he felt it was this beautiful turd that I had just shat into his lap, insulting his vanity, usurping his own story, and swapping out his voice for someone else. And for all these reasons, he reacted the way he did. And I reacted to his reaction with that sense of sadness and disappointment, which belied not only his assholism, but my hypersensitivity and naivete that it really could have been otherwise. So there you have it. What a fun learning experience.